just quickly for intros for anybody on Zoom, although a lot of the faces are old, some are new. I'm Michael Goldberg, and I'm the executive director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve, and I also teach in the business school. And welcome to our Entrepreneurship Speaker Series. And it's great to have Adam Bain. We were just chit-chatting about Cleveland sports. I went from Municipal Stadium to LeBron kissing the trophy to Baker Mayfield. As we determined, Adam has dual sports loyalties now.
Yeah.
San Francisco based, but it is great to have him at least virtually back in Cleveland. He grew up in Cleveland Heights, actually not far from where I'm sitting right now. And we really appreciate you taking the time. Elizabeth is going to be our student moderator today. All of our sessions are student moderated and they're very casual. Elizabeth will sort of be in charge, kind of take questions. For those who are on Zoom or on Facebook Live, please just post questions in the chat. Elizabeth will likely sort of call on you to ask them directly. And if you're on Facebook Live, just post in the chat and Doug or I will sort of grab them in. But Adam, thank you so much for doing this. It's great. It's great to meet you. We met over Twitter. Where else? A few years ago when I realized that you were a Clevelander in the diaspora, and we've been in contact, and really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back, albeit virtually, in Cleveland. And I'm looking forward to someday soon when, at least on the West Coast, we're on a lockdown and we can I can come to Cleveland and visit physically, not just virtually.
Right. All right, Elizabeth, you're in charge.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Goldberg, for the introduction, and thank you to Adam Bain for being here today. My name is Elizabeth Chorad. I am a rising junior studying marketing at Case. I'm actually also an intern here at the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship, so it's really exciting for me to be stepping in a different kind of role for the speaker series today. Like Professor Goldberg said, you can always virtually raise your hand here on Zoom, and I can call on you to ask a question, or you can just type it in the chat, and I can call on you or read it out loud, however you prefer. So thanks again, Adam, for joining us, and we can get started. So Adam Bain is the co-founder and managing partner at O1 Advisors, a venture and advisory firm, and he's the former COO of Twitter. So earlier in your career, you're a producer at Cleveland.com, which we actually discussed how you had a role in creating it. And could you kind of just go throughout your career journey for anyone who may not be familiar with it, and kind of what brought you from being, a producer in Northeast Ohio to eventually working at Twitter and to where you are now, co-founding a venture capital firm?
Yeah, so as Michael mentioned, I grew up in Cleveland Heights and went to Heights High. After I graduated out of Heights, I stayed in Ohio and went to school at Miami of Ohio. When I came out of Miami, I had a degree in journalism, and also, this is now going to date myself a little bit, but right as the web had gone kind of really visual, and I got really excited about sort of the future of journalism in particular and what it meant for publishing vis-a-vis the web and digital platforms. And so I came back to Cleveland and started working at the Plain Dealer to help build out their digital initiatives. And that meant starting Cleveland.com. Back then it was called Cleveland Live. I was actually just going through my t-shirt drawer, and I do have two Cleveland Live t-shirts from the original logo, which was sort of bring me back down memory lane. And so I basically was part of a very small team. There was only like 3 or 4 of us who went out and built all of Cleveland's the Plain Dealers initiatives around news and information in Cleveland. It was mostly a city guide style property back then to keep some of the local digital competitors that were starting to pop out of Cleveland. We went out and also did presence back then for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So it was responsible for one of the first webcasts, I think, ever, which we webcast the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony. Did a bunch of work there, and then wanted to keep pushing into journalism. And so I left Cleveland and Cleveland.com to come out to the LA Times to go work for the LA Times digital platform with a focus on sports, and then left the LA Times a couple years later to go to Fox Sports because I saw kind of this movement around video in the internet and thought that a gap in newspapers ultimately was the lack of video assets, and ended up working there for about 13 years in LA before leaving in 2010 to go to Twitter. And when I joined Twitter, it was less than 100 people, one office location in San Francisco, exactly zero in revenue, and basically was brought in to help open up the business lines for the company. So when I came in, kind of decided that we were going to go forge a path down the advertising revenue stream and data business, which Twitter has today. We went from 0 to $1 billion in revenue faster than almost any other consumer company had done it, and then $1 billion to $2 billion faster than almost anyone had done it. I think only Google, Amazon, and Facebook got there slightly faster than Twitter. We've scaled the team from 100 people or so when I joined to about 6,000 or 7,000 employees, one office location to about 40 globally. About 75% of Twitter's audience was outside the US. Took the company public in 2013 and then ran a public company for a bit. And then I had been there for about 7 years, and I got what I call the 7-year intellectual itch. I was sort of getting bored of doing social media and advertising over and over and over again. And so I left to go explore a bunch of different avenues. And the way to do that, I thought, was through investing and advising companies, and ended up forming a investment firm with our old CEO, Dick Costello. So we kind of got the band back together in 2018, and we raised a couple $100 million venture fund based here in San Francisco to invest in technology growth companies. So companies that were growing and scaling and needed some operator, experience around the table. Oh, Elizabeth, I think you're on mute. There you
go. There you go. That's always the problem with Zoom, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Thanks for giving us that really quick background on yourself. So, like you said, you kind of helped build the team that increased Twitter's revenue into the billions in a very short amount of time. And kind of while Twitter itself was growing very, very rapidly, kind of what was it like managing that kind of growth and just kind of experiencing that kind of growth in general? And how has that carried forward into, I guess, how you approach investing and advising at Owen Advisors?
Yeah, the first bit was we had to build a plan to scale out the revenue. And when we started thinking through how we were going to build out the business overall on the platform, we had a couple different approaches. One way was just to slap, I think, banners and buttons, which were kind of, how most display advertising was done in digital back then. That would have been one path. The other path was a harder path, kind of inspired by what Google and even TV did, which is, take the core content unit and make advertising, a nano version of that. So on Google, you ask a question of Google, you get back a bunch of answers, and some of those answers are sponsored and promoted. On TV, you have, 30-minute stories, and then interlaced in between, you have 30-second stories by advertisers. And so we looked at our Twitter platform and said, okay, we've got tweets. The right advertising model should be, promoted tweets interspersed in between the tweets from people that you follow. It was a harder path because that was unheard of back then, especially because the platform back then even was so mobile, where everybody else was on the desktop. And so my first board meeting was the first week that I joined the company. And so they had asked me to come in and present a strategy after the first week. And my presentation was laying out these two paths and saying, I think we should go down this, the slower but right path for the company, and expected probably like an hour of conversation. And within 2 minutes after pitching it, everybody said, okay, let's go down the correct path. Granted, it would be slower in terms of revenue build. So we spent, the other 55 minutes then talking about the way it could be done. Ultimately what we did is, one of the things that we did when we started bringing revenue into the business is we felt it was important to also get the culture right inside of the company around decision making for revenue. Anytime you turn on revenue in the business, you're always faced with a set of decisions. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a way to communicate to employees the right way to generate revenue versus, in our view, the wrong or short-sighted way. So one of the core values that the company came up with was build a business in a way that makes us proud. And every single employee at the company knew this core value. And it meant that any time that we were faced with a choice, we could ask ourselves, ultimately, would this make us proud as a business? And then chose, the right path. And a really good example of this is when we started launching the ad product in 2010. I think it was Animal Planet, I want to say Animal Planet had a show on with Mike Tyson. And they came to us and asked us if we would change the Twitter bird logo to have a eye tattoo like Mike Tyson. And they would pay us a lot of money to do it. And, we kind of were able to, that was our first real decision point as a business. Do we take easy money, but do something that, we probably ultimately don't want to be associated with it? And that's where falling back on things like build a business in a way that makes us proud ultimately gave us the right path to do that. And so we said no.
Thank you for that answer. I guess kind of related to that, and this is a question that Professor Goldberg inspired me to ask earlier today. But recently Twitter has drawn a lot of attention for labeling President Trump's, some of his tweets as being false claims, which is in stark contrast to Mark Zuckerberg's own decision to kind of like leave the same statements that have been posted on Facebook alone. So even though you're no longer at Twitter, I'm curious to know what you think, that decision-making process behind Twitter's big decision may have looked like, especially because you just mentioned, that core value that you guys have.
Yeah. Well, I think you can rely on that core value today. And basically that should give you a pretty good answer in terms of what to do. So I agree with the decision that Twitter made. And actually think in some ways, while I know it's a hard decision, it actually is a pretty simple decision, especially around labeling the tweet in question, because ultimately the company has a set of guidelines around election misinformation and policing or informing the public when there's inaccurate or outright false information that's flowing through the platform that's designed to influence or change or manipulate free elections. And I think if you look at the actual tweet in question, in Twitter's view, they ruled that it was the information there would lead somebody to misunderstand some facts around mail-in ballots. And so they basically left the tweet up with a pretty big disclaimer that this tweet contains false information around around mail-in ballots. They provided a link to information about the real election information around mail-in ballots. But they left it up for newsworthiness because it came from the president's account. I think the question ultimately, though, is going further than that. And so the question that the company is grappling with is ultimately beyond just election misinformation. The next realm of content are abusive and harassing tweets. And then the other level of, for sure, is just overall misinformation. And the question that the company is dealing with in that final bucket, in terms of just overall misinformation, is how do you or do you arbitrate truth on the platform? Is that possible both from a resource, technology, and effort standpoint? And there's probably some stuff that's black and white, and then a lot of stuff that's kind of in the middle in terms of gray area. And so how do you make decisions based on that? When it comes to harassment or threats, that's also something that I think actually is a little bit easier to adjudicate on the platform. And so in some ways, while again, I know that there's been a lot of agita around the company and the industry, to me, it seems a pretty clear decision, and frankly, an easy decision that that this was stepping over the line because it violated their election misinformation guidelines. It will be interesting to see what else they launch from here. Twitter also made some reference to some other products and features that are coming out soon, which should give them a better handle on bullying, harassment, and also just in general misinformation.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. It's definitely something I've also been thinking a lot, as well as like someone who uses social media pretty often. So right now we have our first question from the audience. So if Eddie, you could unmute yourself and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hey Adam, thanks for joining us today. I'm a recent graduate of Case Western Reserve. I was in Professor Goldberg's class, Entrepreneurship Strategy, in the spring. I graduated with a bachelor's in chemical engineering with some interest in entrepreneurship. So my question is regarding your current VC firm. What kind of values do you look for in companies that you invest in, and what role do you see your firm playing in these investments?
Yeah, so thanks, Eddie. We're a little bit different in terms of, well, trying to be a little bit different, just based on the fact that we're not really kind of professional investors. We haven't come up through the VC community. We were operators first. Now, everybody at our firm, albeit small, are former operators. And so our idea is when we work with a company, we are former operators first versus investors. And so the advantage is, when we look at a company, we like to see a company who is scaling like crazy. In fact, the bolts are probably coming off the rocket ship in a good way. The CEO and the management team is having, problems of scaling, but good kind of problems, the type of problems that every business would want. And they are open to ideas and help from, former operators. I think an operator point of view versus a VC point of view into companies are somewhat different. VCs are amazing in terms of, at times, in terms of being able to, step back and really kind of view the company from afar and its place in the ecosystem or the strategy overall. I think from an operator point of view, since you've lived it and actually been in the seat and been in the chair, you're able to kind of relate to the founder and the management team in a different way because you've likely faced a bunch of the things that they're going through. And we'll do things like we'll go sit in a management team meeting or in a all hands meeting and take notes and basically give feedback to the founder and the management team about what we saw, which is different. You wouldn't normally see a VC, in those types of meetings overall. And so it's just it's a different way of investing. It's investing by going in and kind of being almost like first person instead of third person investment.
Thanks, Eddie, for your question. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Goldberg because I think he has a question.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. A quick question. We were chatting a little bit as we were getting started before we sort of went live about kind of the Clevelanders in the diaspora. We talked about a couple of other mutual friends like Marty Levine, a fellow Clevelander, Miamian out in the Bay Area working for Facebook, and a number of folks, and we broadcast this out to alumni chapters around the country, actually, and around the world. So we've got Clevelanders and case folks, who spent time in Cleveland and sort of left. I'm sort of curious of your thoughts on sort of connectivity back to your hometown, either wearing an investor hat about, is this a moment where, particularly sort of given the changes and where we're all sitting, there's some discussion about maybe this is a moment when folks in the Bay Area come back to cities like Cleveland because of cost of living and access to fresh water and all these things. I'm sort of curious what your thoughts are about your hometown and sort of connectivity back. And are there things that our entrepreneurship community here could be doing to kind of increase connectivity to folks like you that are deploying capital or have connections?
Yeah. Well, one is I look back at my time in Cleveland incredibly fondly. Growing up in Cleveland Heights, it was at the time, it was one of the most multicultural communities in the United States. And so the perspective that I had growing up was helpful then later on in my career. I think I was surprised that when I came out to the West Coast, there was virtually no connectivity for Clevelanders, Ohio, or even the university that I went to. You mentioned Marnie, who was the COO of Instagram and now is back working at Facebook again. I mentioned Ryan Graves as well, who also went to school in Ohio and was the first CEO of Uber before Travis Kalanick came back in and started running it again. So I was just kind of surprised. There was virtually no network, if you will, from the Midwest out here on the West Coast. And so we started to try to do that a little bit, but I think it's still pretty lightweight and not as strong as I would hope. That said, I think especially what is happening now vis-a-vis pandemic related, I do think you've got a complete change in terms of workforce and work patterns. The move to virtual has been a pretty big sea change for every company. Twitter basically just announced that you don't ever have to come back to the office. You can work from home infinitely. Now it's created interesting challenges. There's some folks, for example, in the UK who said, great, I'll move, countries ultimately and just work on UK hours. And so those are things that, probably some change that they weren't quite ready for. But I do think you did have, the digital gold rush out here. You had the first gold rush, and then probably a bunch of other people who moved out to San Francisco to be in and around the digital explosion from a talent perspective. In recent time, most of that now has started moving into other areas as well. It's just been hard to attract and retain talent. Prices in terms of real estate, just overall expense had gotten out of control. And I think this move with COVID and the permission that each one of these companies now have given their employees to work remotely has meant that I think you're going to see a bunch of movement out of cities. And I think it may be the case that you will see people move from the West Coast back home, where companies ultimately can be started without, employees, who are very flighty and move, between startup to startup, and instead have some staying power. And so I do think there's the beginnings of some interesting capital networks for investment for startups in and around the Midwest as well. So I think that's a totally viable outcome of COVID is both investment and also employees and startups moving out of the West Coast back into the Midwest.
Great. Thanks, Adam.
Yeah, so now we have Victor who has a question. If you could unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask your question.
Hi, Adam. My name is Victor. I'm a rising senior at Case Western. I just wanted to mention that I was able to attend the One Crucial Thing event hosted by North Coast Ventures a couple weeks ago. And I remember you talking about the power of optimism during these tough times. I do think this is really good advice, and was wondering if you had an example of this where this was especially true for any of your own portfolio companies or partners.
Yeah, we did that event a couple weeks ago, and the idea was finding one 2-minute theme to riff on, and mine was the power of optimism. And the idea being simply that there are, especially now, there's a lot of reason to be, and you can't blame people for being pessimistic or looking at what's happening right now in the world with a jaundiced eye. But I do think both in culture, life, and also in business, there is an incredible power in optimism, and it's deep-seated. It basically, by optimism, I'm talking about, the idea that you actually have the power to drive change, and that if you view things from an optimistic lens, that you ultimately can look around, and if you don't like what's going on, you can actually make improvements or ultimately create change on your own. In business, I'll give you a great example of this. There's a company that, I'll give you two. One is a story of a company who I'm on the board of. It's a company called GOAT, which is a sneaker marketplace. They'll do, I think they'll do $1 billion plus of sneaker sales this year. And this is a place where you can go on into the app and find hot sneakers that have been previously owned but never worn by other people. And it kind of revolutionized a bit of, sneaker fashion, since some of these sneakers were hard to find and hard to obtain. The company didn't start as a sneaker company, though. It's been super successful right now, but actually they had raised money initially as a group dinner dating website. And it was a place where you could basically go on a group dinner date for 12 people. And I think they raised a couple $100K to go do this. And they started working on it, and it just was like not working. And the company had burned through a bunch of money and were left, I think, on their last $100,000 of investment. And they went back to the investors and said, look, this group dinner dating website idea was a good idea, but it's just not working. And so we want to return the last $100,000 that we have back to you, the investors. And luckily the investors were like, look, we're in the business of writing checks. We don't know how to take money back in from companies. So take that last $100,000 and go find something interesting to pivot to. And so the two founders, Eddie and Daishin, went home that night, and they were sitting around their kitchen table trying to figure out an idea to pivot to from group dinner dating websites. And Daishin, one of the co-founders, had just ordered some sneakers from eBay. And as they were talking about what business to build, he opened up the box of these $500 pair of sneakers that he had ordered, and he pulled them out of the box and showed them to Eddie. And they realized pretty quickly that they were completely fake. So it was a complete waste of $500, and it wasn't even a good fraud. It was just a terrible fake pair of sneakers. And so with that, they identified the problem that there's fraud in a bunch of these marketplaces. And so how do you actually create a safer vehicle without fraud? And so they pivoted from group dinner dating website to sneakers based on having a bad customer experience on eBay. And pretty instantly from this pivot, the business went asymmetric. They've had incredible success. Twitter also, by the way, started as a podcasting, as an audio service, and not the Twitter that we know today. So I think two examples there on the business side. I'll give you one more, which is a company that I was involved in as an investor that went through a really tough time. The CEO, financially, the business wasn't working. The CEO ultimately had to make a bunch of tough choices, including laying off a number of employees. They were having a hard time raising funding, and ultimately raised funding on a down round, which was a pretty major down round. So the valuation that they took was much lower than the previous valuation that they had taken before. He called and basically said, "Look, I'm pretty much like thinking that this is the end of the company." And through talking it out, he kind of got back to this mode of, why he originally founded the company in the first place, and decided to take an optimistic view of potential on the business and potential ahead. He started basically building the business back up from scratch. He literally was on sales calls himself after releasing the entire sales team as well. They now have built back the business to an incredible stage. In less than a year of this happening, the business is now doing more in revenue than it's ever done before. And so I've just seen, companies and founders who have a deeply optimistic view of themselves, of potential, and as a result, single-handedly have moved the ball forward. While I don't know if it's directly in optimism, I still put it in this category, but it's also determinism as well. I told this story at that event around Charlie Munger, who's Warren Buffett's business partner, and Charlie's had one of his eyes taken out due to a horrific cataract surgery, and recently his other eye started acting up. I think it's like his eye was filling up with blood, and he was finding it hard to see. He went to the doctor, and the doctor told him that he wasn't going to be able to see out of his other eye. And here's a business person who his entire business is basically built on him reading, and his number one passion and pastime also is reading. He basically was dealt, incredibly tough news, and then decided, what, I'm going to both take an optimistic view of the future. And here's somebody who's, in his 80s now, but decided now's the time to learn Braille. And so he started learning Braille. Now, turns out he didn't need it because the condition in his eye ended up clearing up, and he he now can see out of that eye again. But I do think there is a message and a lesson in terms of both optimism and determinism. And I think that works in business, but I think it works in life. And frankly, with everything that's happening right now in society, I think it's more important now than ever.
Yeah, thank you for that really detailed answer, and thanks, Victor, for your question. Right now, Tiffany has a question, so if you could unmute yourself and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Tiffany McNamara, and I work pretty closely with the Veale Institute. I'm at Sears ThinkBox, which is our innovation space here at Case Western Reserve. I'm also married to a Heights grad, so he speaks, we're 2 miles outside of Heights, and it kills him still to this day that we don't live back in the Heights. So maybe someday. So I work along with Michael and Todd and Doug closely with a lot of the students and some that may be on this session now. You talked very humbly about your career, you know, what you have done over the last several years and the successes that you've had. When we talk to our students and upon graduation, even preparing for graduation, we talk to them about, you know, the broader picture. What does it really look like to have your degree, and what does your future look like? Some of the things that we talk about are, you know, how and when to take those risks, how to use the connections, how to lean on your mentors. What would you say was if there were one or two things that was pivotal to getting to the successes that you have seen in your career?
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. I think probably the biggest one ultimately is never passing up an opportunity. I think I mean, in every career move that I've had, it's ultimately because of some relationship that I had set up that I just kept, you know, working. And so like the move, for example, from out of the LA Times to sports was from somebody who tried to hire me into CNN in Atlanta. And at the time it was between going to CNN and going to the LA Times. I flew into Atlanta and spent the day with CNN, and then I flew out to LA to go spend the day with the LA Times. And I said, you know what, I'd rather be in LA. And so I made my career decision there. But I went back to the person at CNN. I said, look, I'm going to take this job in LA, but if you ever find yourself in LA, we should stay in touch. I'm here. And I kept kind of harboring that relationship over the years. He then ended up in LA. Actually, he ended up in New York and needed to hire somebody in LA to run sports. And so I literally was a candidate pool of one, I think, because he didn't know anybody else in LA. My move then from there into Twitter happened because Dick Costello, we actually looked at acquiring Dick's company before he was at Twitter. He founded and ran a company called FeedBurner that I felt like we should acquire. And Google ended up acquiring the business. I stayed in, so we missed out on that opportunity, but I stayed in touch with and in close contact with Dick. And then when he joined Twitter in 2009, he started calling me and saying, you got to come over. So I think chasing down every single opportunity, even if it doesn't seem like it's going to bear fruit, is something that's worked for me, at least in the past. And then I do think, you know, taking risk, a healthy amount of risk, is I think a good thing. I think especially like in every career move that I've had, I felt a little bit in over my head, and I've realized that that's healthy. You know, it challenges you, it helps drive you, moving from in a position to position or company to company. If you feel a little bit like you are moving in a direction where you're learning, like there's this whole pendulum, I think, in careers between learning and doing, and finding a good balance between learning and doing. Too much learning, you're in way too much over your head, you're drowning, but too much doing is boring as well. And so I do feel like pushing yourself even to be uncomfortable is important. And then lastly, I joked in that event a couple weeks ago, but I think having a healthy dyslexia to the word no, we've all heard no throughout our lives. I think basically seeing the word no as on gives you a different perspective. And anytime someone tells me no, I turn on, and that's when I, move into a mode of trying to get to yes. And so I think not letting people ultimately tell you no, and ultimately having that dyslexia to the word no, I think is a good thing.
Thanks, Tiffany, for your question. Right now, I believe Katie has a question. So if you could unmute yourself, Katie, and introduce yourself and ask it.
Sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hey, Adam. This is Katie, an alumna who does live in Cleveland Heights right now. It's not so bad unless it's January. So going to what you kind of just talked about in terms of risks, you had talked about when you're looking for opportunities with your current company, you're looking for companies that see explosive growth. So my question is, how do you balance that with more of the opportunistic companies that are quickly introducing some of the more much needed solutions, like some of the COVID-19 contact tracing and that type of stuff that might seem like a high risk, but also seem like something that's fitting at the right time at the right place?
Yeah, I mean, that stuff to me is precisely growth, right? So technology growth investing is starting probably small on the revenue stream, but is growing quickly. All the stuff in the COVID investment category right now has potential to, or already is growing quickly. In fact, some of the things that people can invest in on the COVID side, there's no question that it's got growth potential. There, in the short term, the question is over the long term, it's sort of unknown. What we look for ultimately is a CEO and a management team that are thinking smartly about growth, and that ultimately fast-growing technology companies are challenging at times to manage because you're trying to juggle priorities, and you classically have this sort of growth mindset versus sort of profit mindset. I think ultimately I feel like there's two modes of any business, and also with people as well. You're either building value or extracting value, and all things being equal, building value is much more fun. It feels much more rewarding. It feels like things, while it's not a straight line, it feels like building up, whether it's businesses or companies, and certainly people, it's much more interesting than being on the other end of it, which is just extracting value and ultimately, taking profits, et cetera. So you do want to find a balance, but most of the stuff that we're looking at right now is on the build side.
Okay,
Thank you.
So now this might be our last or second to last question, but Dana Luisa has one. So if you could unmute yourself, Dana Luisa.
Oh, hi. I think I'm the only one in the panel outside of the US. I am Donna Louisa Eversley. I am an entrepreneur, MBA student, specializing in entrepreneurship with the University of Liverpool. I'm a huge Michael Goldberg fan from beyond Silicon Valley, which I think every entrepreneur should do. And it has made a big impact on me. But one of the things in listening to you, what I like, there are two things I want to make mention of. The first thing I like is the fact that you mentioned you would go into the investment companies that you work with, and you would go in and sit in on meetings and give ideas and give feedback. And I think that is a big plus. I think that is what is missing overall in getting startups to be successful. I think many times that connection or that bold-faced involvement is helping to mitigate risk for both parties. And I think that is essential. So I think kudos to you with that one. The other one I wanted to, the other thing is really a question. Have you ever had a major setback with a business opportunity and you had to rebound from it? Things were tough, but you had no choice but to rebound from it. And what is something that you would have, you think would have contributed to that resolution, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Donna Luisa. I think in terms of setback, probably the thing that in my biggest sort of fails, the thing that I looking back on it, the thing ultimately that I've learned is not to dwell too much on the failure piece and instead looking ahead. Sometimes I think we're all guilty of this, is getting too introspective on really understanding or really dwelling on the fact that you failed. And so I think certainly in Silicon Valley, there is an environment where it's more a learning environment. Like, failure obviously isn't good, but there's a lot to learn from failure. And what I think has been most interesting about technology companies out here is that the kind of quick, it's like sailing, the quick kind of tack changes that you're able to make. You fail, while you're sailing, you fail all along the way, but you're able to quickly adjust and move. And I think that's what's been the biggest learning is, especially in traditional media, where I think working in traditional media or traditional businesses, there's kind of a more high risk, high fail, and then dwelling on failure instead of being more in a learning environment. We one of the things that we did at Twitter was really focus on not what did I fail at, but what was I too slow to learn? And there is a priority around learning. We spent a little bit of time with the Navy SEALs and some other kind of elite groups, specific around learning, and asking them what kind of cultural things did they do in an organization to actually drive learning behavior. The SEALs in particular have something that they started called after action review. And it literally is after any event that the SEALs go out and do, that team comes back together at the end of the action. And they stand around in a circle and literally describe in a blameless way, if they had to do it again, what actions would they sustain and what things would they improve. And this is literally like life and death style situations. So there's a lot to learn about these after action reviews, and doing it in a blameless way, and not dwelling on it, but thinking about the go forward. So I do think like creating a learning organization, an organization that is really putting priority around the speed of learning as much as they are at speed of execution, ultimately will get you to results, instead of just saying that, the only thing that we prioritize here is winning. Because I think you create a culture where you're not going to win all the time, and you won't have learned anything when you don't.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Donna Luisa. So to kind of wrap us up, I was wondering if you had any insight to how COVID-19 has affected O1 advisors and investing in Silicon Valley in general.
Well, I think for O1 advisors, we had just raised our first official fund back in October. And so when COVID hit, pretty much everybody in the venture community took about 5 or 6 weeks to go through their entire portfolio to understand what this meant for each one of their companies. For us, since we didn't have that many investments, instead of 5 or 6 weeks, it took us about 5 or 6 days. And so we decided to get aggressive in funding companies that we thought had potential, especially, or would have tailwind as a result of behavior shifts that were coming to society based on it. And so there's that old line about being greedy when everybody else is fearful, and fearful when everybody else is greedy. So we definitely seeing a lot of fear back in early March. We started late February, early March. We really started to push the pedal to the metal in terms of investing in ideas or behind founders that we thought were going to be improved ultimately in the long run because of some of the society changes that were coming. So that was with us. I do think there are huge shifts still that are coming around work, how we learn. So I think education in particular is one that we've gone pretty deep on. I do think both as for adults and also kids, watching even my own kids in terms of how all of a sudden, because of COVID, they, had a sea change of tools at their disposal. I think that's been interesting to watch. We made an investment in a company called Masterclass, partly because we thought the same mode was coming for both entertainment and learning together for adults. And so I think sort of how we work, how we learn, and a bit of how we play or entertain ourselves. We're going to come out of COVID probably meaningfully changed. I also think from a science perspective, it is going to be fascinating to watch. And again, as someone who will take the optimistic point of view that science and technology hopefully also will lead us out of the struggle with COVID in a better place. Ultimately, it's going to speed up a bunch of technological change that had been kind of hanging around the edges, and also provides a bunch of capital to areas of science that probably were underfunded before. I'm excited about what I think is going to come and change in science, and especially health tech. So I do, while it's dire right now in a bunch of ways, I do think coming out of COVID will, change meaningfully on the health tech side as well.
Yeah, well, it looks like we're almost out of time. So thank you to everyone who asked a question. And thank you so much to Adam Bain for his thoughtful answers. I'm going to throw it back to Professor Goldberg, and he can close us out.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. You did a great job moderating. Just a couple of quick announcements before we sort of do our final thank yous and goodbyes. We have two sessions next week. On Tuesday, June 16th, another case member in the diaspora of San Francisco, Eric Verplug, who is the managing director at Deutsche Telekom Capital Partners, will be with us next Tuesday. And then next Friday, we'll change topics in the entrepreneurship world to the world of dentistry. So we have two dentists, practicing dentists, Jeff Rosenthal and Margaret Frankel, both represent different types of practices. Jeff has a 7-practice, sort of larger. Margaret's a solo entrepreneur. So that'll be next week. So hope you can join us. Adam, thank you for doing this. It was a lot of fun. It was great to have you back virtually. We look forward to sports starting up again.
Exactly.
And cheering for our Cleveland sports teams, or at least part of your sports portfolio, your Cleveland part. And we'd love to have you on campus and in Cleveland when you're back here. So thank you for taking the time, and it's great to connect with you.
Thank you, Professor Goldberg, and thanks for everybody else. And I'll just give a final kind of tie-in then to your future topic. One of the things that when I came back to Cleveland and started working with Cleveland.com, I was working a couple different jobs at once. So Cleveland was one. The other was I was working for a bunch of dentists and orthodontists to rewrite all of their correspondence using my journalism skills and writing skills. I put it to good work right after graduation. And so I probably know more about writing empowering notes to parents of, potential kids that, have braces. So if you need any good one-liners about how, changing their teeth ultimately will help change their minds, I've got a bunch of really good one-liners.
We're gonna work that into our dentistry session next week. Awesome. Very good. Well, thanks for taking the time, Adam, and thanks to everybody on Zoom and Facebook for joining, and we'll see you soon.